In 2018, remasters and reboots surface faster than a submerged cat in a pool and are usually about as much fun as holding a soaking wet pissed off feline right next to your face. It is no wonder why so many gamers rose their eyebrows and probably their middle fingers at Sony Santa Monica when they announced that they were rebooting the legendary God of War franchise. Probably because most gamers know it is no longer a matter of if one of their favorite franchises is going into the oven for a reboot, it's a matter of when, and if the new owners can cook, or whether they'll burn the house of your franchise down and piss on the flames. A lot of skepticism surrounds Sony Santa Monica's spiritual reboot to the legendary God of War franchise. Nobody was really asking for this reboot, or the many changes it has made to the iconic God of War formula. Skeptics, lay your doubts to rest. Hold out your hand and summon a copy of this game to you like Thor's hammer. You'll be happy you did. I always felt that the original God of War story and brilliant portrayal of Greek mythology was always overlooked and underrated. But I could also understand why, seeing as that it was literally drowning underneath the oceans of blood spilled by Kratos in the original series. 2018's God of War will not fall victim to having its action-overpowered story like previous entries. It will not rest on the simple notes of vengeance and hatred that drove Kratos before. Instead, the action adds weight to the story, and both continuously manage to dance madly under a Nordic sun. This tale, woven deep into Norse mythology, is a masterfully crafted tale of a former god-slaying world destroyer trying to raise a decent son in a foreign land where Kratos can't read or speak any of its many languages, only bringing his prejudice of the gods with him to Midgard, where he only seeks to live as a man, and has also had a son with a woman from Midgard, a mortal, whose life has ended before the game even starts. In fact, the game opens with a moving and silent ceremony that is quite the opposite form of death that God of War fans are used to in the opening of a God of War game. And this perhaps underlines one of God of War's biggest strengths. It is amazing in the places you least expect it to be for the reasons you did not expect it to be. From Kratos' cabin in the woods, we are given our simple task: to take Kratos' boy, son, to the highest summit and spread the mother's ashes. On paper, God of War's plot certainly does not make a case for being a masterpiece, especially when you realize that this entire game is shot using one single continuous camera shot, a task that is much harder to accomplish than most may realize. The storytelling ability, visuals, and voice acting, combined with the set pieces and action of God of War, will invoke powerful emotions in its players, as it is a story built on relatability. Even though our characters are dealing with creatures and entities of godlike strength in a world containing multiple dimensions that is the very definition of fantasy, it is absolutely remarkable how the game's story always manages to stay down to earth once the dust settles. It barely ever slows down, is packed full of detailed lore and characters, but never overwhelms the player. The sum of all of God of War's parts between its campaign, additional lore, banter, hidden elsewhere can bewilder the mind, send chills through your skin, make you laugh, pull on your heartstrings, all while bursting out the seams with God of War's trademark intense, fast-paced, in-your-face action. However, for its large-scale and expertly crafted world filled with mystery, at the end of the day, it is Kratos himself that manages to be the glue that holds everything together. Make no mistake, this is still the Ghost of Sparta, and Sony Santa Monica have done an incredible job of capturing what a regret-filled Godslayer might become given the second chance to start over and raise a son. The preservation of Kratos' character makes the game feel like the long-awaited continuation of the original trilogy. Even though Kratos' original voice actor, T.C. Carson, has been kicked to the curb, it is for good reason this time. T.C. Carson will always be the voice of vengeance incarnate, but this time around, the role requires a slightly more delicate, intimate touch, and Christopher Judge turns Kratos into what you might expect for an ancient god. This is a voice acting performance that will instantly be called one of the greatest of all time. Kratos' voice demands your attention, because it will feel like the voice of a god is thundering through your speakers and echoing through your body. His choice of words, strict discipline, and total disregard for humor is beyond memorable. Despite being mostly one tone, he somehow manages to convey deep emotions, especially when speaking intimately with his son. Kratos' son, Boy the Atreus, finds himself in somewhat uncharted waters for a character. He is the son of another god's mythology, but mostly exists in another mythology's lore. He is also somewhat a stranger to Kratos and players alike. His transformation from boy into boy is one of the greatest things in gaming to date. The rest of the supporting cast all stand out with big personalities and great voice actors with their own plot lines and character development. However, there is a main flaw I see within the supporting characters, in that they only exist out of a convenience for Kratos, and he just so happens to meet just enough people to get the job done, which include powerful healers, legendary blacksmiths, and an ancient lore master that will literally take you headfirst into the history of Midgard and its 9 realms. And Kratos meets almost nobody else. One of the game's weakest chains is also its villains and their plot lines, especially their motivations for hunting Kratos down as viciously as they do. What little details exist aren't very fleshed out, especially compared to how much effort goes into crafting Kratos' and Boy's motivations for their task. It is one of the few negative drawbacks from the decision to have the camera stay on Kratos and Boy the entire game. And for what it's worth, these flaws still don't manage to really take away from too much of the game. It is really hard to be mad at it sometimes when you look at some of these visuals, which at times in certain locations are arguably the best to date in gaming. However, there are definitely some weaker textures and weaker moments, but they don't really affect the overall visuals too much. The lighting and color palette come together perfectly, whether you're trekking through ancient ruins containing beautiful golden inscriptions and artwork hidden everywhere, or through fire and brimstone. Everything in God of War simply looks amazing most of the time. The reality distorting effects, particles, and elemental effects are stunning all the time. With perhaps an exception to fire, it can look fuzzy and dim sometimes, and snow effects later in the game also add a blurriness when combined with the fog, which is another complaint of the game that I have. The fog is incredibly thick in some areas in the game, and later on when it is snowing, there's just too much white on the screen. It doesn't look right. It's very noticeable in some areas, especially considering that the game does not really feature a very detailed map in or out of the HUD, which inspires its players to maybe use landmarks more often, but when you have to see past a giant wall of fog, it doesn't really go well all the time. Perhaps one of the biggest changes to God of War is the gameplay, taking a hard turn towards precision and accuracy. Director Cory Balrog has actually said that this is thanks to From Software's Dark Souls series, or rather a loop inside the combat of Dark Souls. However, this may have been more of a humble compliment, because I think that the mid-game onwards, 10 to 15 hours in of this 30 to 40 hour game, that God of War's combat may enter a place of its own thanks to the ability to fuse precision, speed, and intensity while retaining the elements of a power fantasy like the old God of War games. The biggest problem that the combat suffers from is the initial learning curve and how it starts out so bare bones it is mind-blowing looking back. The game seemed almost unfair and unbalanced at first, and very repetitive, for many reasons, and that the days of God of War being a power fantasy were over. They are not. The camera sits much closer to Kratos now, and for the first time is not fixed. People familiar with The Witcher 3, the Soulsborne series, or Horizon Zero Dawn will be right at home with the camera and the weight in Kratos' movements. The Leviathan Axe is Kratos' new instrument of death, and it sings cold songs of calculated death. It has a rhythm and heaviness to it that would make any heavy metal Viking band proud. Status ailments like the Leviathan's Frost enchantment are one of the game's many new RPG elements being introduced in God of War, and they are useful in and out of combat frequently, alongside a new wrist-mounted shield that can also be used to parry and reflect attacks, much like the Golden Fleece from the original series. The rhythm and weight of Leviathan is something that the blades never had. In addition, Kratos can throw and recall the axe similar to Thor's famous technique with his hammer Mjolnir. While it may sound simple, the axe has a lot of uses, both in and especially out of combat, especially when you can add on its long-range abilities. The axe is also frequently used in the game's many creative and fun puzzles, both in the campaign but especially in the many optional areas. I was always finding new ways to make the most of the Leviathan and its frost enchantment. Even after 40 hours of gameplay, I was still throwing my axe into anything and everything, and the feeling of calling it back never gets old. In fact, it's been about 30 minutes since I've thrown the axe, and I already feel axe withdrawal symptoms coming about me. When the axe is out of Kratos' hands become a weapon, and a pretty formidable one at that. Also, fighting barehanded is the best way to build up the game's new stun bar, which results in Kratos being able to do a pretty brutal grab or finisher that usually results in a projectile or explosion of some sort, and can also be used to just take a breath during a chaotic battle. Spartan Rage and Magic also return. Spartan Rage changes Kratos' bare hand moveset, while Magic has been turned into the game's light and heavy runic attacks, which is still attached to a weapon, but now the game has many runic attacks to offer and can be changed on the fly, vastly changing the way players play the game and allowing players to find playstyles that they like, especially when combined with the game's new RPG elements in crafting and character building. All armor pieces will have the potential to have passive perks attached to them in addition to gem slots. Gems are a way of fine-tuning Kratos' new stats. Stats rely heavily on gear and will reflect Kratos' overall power level, so constantly crafting, mixing, and matching and experimenting is encouraged, even though resources can seem a bit scarce early in the game. God of War takes quality over quantity with its enemy design. You will notice a lot of reskinned enemies, especially for the lower tier guys. However, these lower tier reskins will gain more and more variants and abilities throughout the game. Everything from arcing mortar projectiles, super speed, deployable shields, kamikazes, dual wieldings, tanks. There are aerial enemies with different elemental and status inducing effects, highly evasive enemies that use hit and run strategies, and large scale enemies. Gameplay is not all perfect though. Some situations are downright unfair and lazy depending on enemy combination. One mistake can lead to death even for the most well thought out builds. Also, one of the game's biggest flaws is its boss battles and mini-bosses. They are mostly reskinned trolls that are probably my least favorite design in the game. They act as nice measuring sticks at the very least, but some levels really deserve a better boss, especially levels that were more relevant to the plot. There are other optional hidden bosses that make up for this, like the Valkyries post-game, that could scratch the itch for those looking to really put their skills to the test, and are a great example of the game's addictive and rewarding side quests, but they can also be a bit repetitive too. The game's soundtrack is my biggest gripe with the game, and I expect a lot of people to tell me that I'm wrong. While I definitely enjoy the main theme and melody, I found about half the soundtrack pretty disappointing and very similar to The Witcher's soundtrack. While it perfectly suits and enhances the subtly intense, intimate, ominous, or atmospheric moments, it really has very little to offer for the action-packed moments or boss fights. I feel that many of the game's action-heavy moments or bosses could have been even greater if composer Bear McCreary was able to kick it up a notch occasionally. I'm not asking for an album full of war drums here, but boss songs and action-heavy cutscenes feel like they're missing a little something. But I do recognize that the soundtrack is well made and expertly crafted nonetheless. Time and passion has definitely gone into it, and the sound design more than makes up for any shortcomings in the game's soundtrack. In fact, it's easily the best sounding God of War game ever. Whether it's the Leviathan axe dancing and slicing through the air, Kratos ripping open a wolf's mouth, or the thunderous roar of bigger enemies. The sound design is another flawless game-enhancing feature. God of War is a small landmark in gaming and a perfect example of the endless possibilities unique to the gaming medium alone that other mediums cannot ever hope to achieve. It is the result of imaginative, rewarding, and intense gameplay being perfectly fused to incredible storytelling while offering plenty to see and do off the beaten path. When great developers are allowed to let their imaginations unleash and are given the funding and time to experiment, the gaming world is treated to titles like this. A game that just wants to be a game, not a paid service or something you have to think about after you leave the store. It sets the stage perfectly for a new franchise, and even though the ending is a bit anticlimactic and vague, this particular story has a beginning, middle, and end, perfectly capturing the essence of a 1,000-year-old godslayer. I give 2018's God of War a godly 9. Alright everybody, thanks for joining me here today. My name's Adam, also known as Moo. Be sure to check out GamingInstincts.com for all the latest news and articles, and be sure to check out GamingInstinctsTV for more God of War videos. Peace out everybody.